Our guest, Ben Morris, is the host of the podcast Crime Capsule. Since 2021, Crime Capsule has delivered fascinating interviews with authors from Arcadia Publishing and the History Press. Crime Capsule was named a Platinum winner in the 2022 Muse Awards and a 2022 Communicator Award of Excellence from the Academy of Interactive and Visual Arts. It was also nominated for a 2023 Ambie Award in the Best True Crime Podcast category.
Ben Morris is not just the host of Crime Capsule, he's also an acclaimed writer himself. He wrote Hattiesburg, Mississippi, a history of the hub city, as well as numerous collections of poetry. He's received many honors for his writing, including a Pushcart nomination, the Chancellor's Medal for Poetry from the University of Cambridge, and the Academy of American Poets Prize from Duke University. He's also the coordinator of the New Orleans Poetry Festival. Now, I promised Dee I wouldn't make this interview about poetry, so that's the last time I'm going to bring it up, but I did want to mention his credits. And before we get into our interview, I just want to note that I had a little bit of trouble with my microphone in the interview, so I may sound a little different, but hopefully you can understand everything we say. All right, let's bring you the interview with Ben Morris. Hi, Ben. Thank you for joining us today. We are delighted to have you here to talk a little bit more about Crime Capsule. I guess to start, why don't we just hear from you if you could explain how did this podcast start and how did you become involved originally?
Yeah, of course, absolutely. And thank you for the invitation. I'm very grateful to be here. It's a real pleasure to get to hang out and to meet other members of the larger family that is out there of folks who are interested in these sorts of things. I will also note that my assistant producer, a tortoiseshell named Snickers, is here in the studio with me. It's a great question, actually, Jeff. And the origin story is actually kind of interesting. So Crime Capsule started as a website about, let's call it 5 or so years ago. And it was the brainchild of a publishing company, Arcadia Publishing, which also operates the History Press, which realized that it was sitting on a backlist of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of titles that were spread out all across the country, that were written by local authors that had great expertise in their subjects. And many of these titles pertained to topics that were of interest to, crime history, to American history, to local history, refracted through different contexts. You had authors who were from the areas, right, who knew their regions, their cities, their cases extremely well. And these titles, this backlist, the long tail, as they call it, was just not getting mobilized, right? It was just kind of sitting there. And so my former editor, I am a History Press author, among other things, and I'd written a history of a city in Mississippi, my hometown, a little place called Hattiesburg, worked with an editor named Kristen Thompson, and one day Kristen reached out and said, we're trying to start this thing. Do you know anyone who would be interested? And at the time, I had just bought a house and needed a new job because there's this thing called a mortgage. No. And we got to talking about it, and we thought, it would actually be fun to try to partner up and see what this could turn into. And so the way it started was we were digging into the backlist of these History Press titles and finding, what are the really interesting ones? What are the ones that are coming back to prominence if there's been a break in a case, say? What are we doing in California? What are we doing in Chicago, New York, the coasts, the Midlands, wherever we are, right? What are the cases that are kind of lighting up in the news? Do we have any titles that speak to those? How can we bring those back to attention? And so we started off as a website, and for the first couple of years, we wrote articles about the cases that were popping back up and that had relevance and so forth. And then we switched to the new media format. We switched to a podcast, and so it was a really, really great joy. I mean, I have to say, because I got paid to read and to think about these issues with some regularity. And I'll say this. I want to say this right up front. Last thing I'll say by way of introduction. One of the things that we try very hard to do at Crime Capsule, it is baked into our structure, into our format, is to draw on the expertise and the research of the folks who wrote the books about the cases. So I am not an expert on any one of these cases, and I do not presume to be an expert on any one of these cases. Often if I'm reading an author's book, I might be coming to that case for the very first time. They are the expert, and it is my job as a host to draw out their expertise, what they have learned, what might be new in their analysis, or what might be original to their particular account, that sort of thing. Discuss those issues with them. So I will say this: I really appreciated, Dee, your claim that we were weird. When in the accounting of the battle, between us and the other show, yes, we are weird that it is just titles by one particular publisher, but it was meant to be that way from the very beginning. It was part of the plan to be so weird.
I mean, is weird not another word you could use for niche? Like, if you have your niche, that this is where you're gonna something is gonna be successful. And I think I definitely mentioned that when I was discussing the crime battle, because I just never heard of it before. It felt very narrow in a way when you're only working with one publishing company. But now that we've discussed it and you've really explained the history behind it, it's not as narrow as it, I think, appears on the surface. Moving on to something slightly different, one thing I noted is sometimes I feel like people find it really hard to connect with history. They can find it boring or unrelatable, but I feel like you've a really good way of bridging a gap between people now and history. And really, that's what I found anyway from listening to a number of episodes of the podcast. You find connection points, and I would just love to hear about your process for that. Or is that something that you intentionally seek out to do?
What a lovely question. How kind of you to say so. It is something that I do try to do. I don't know if I'm always successful, but I'll tell you one thing that we used to say a lot in my old graduate department when I was still overseas as a grad student, working in archaeology and in sort of anthropology and history and so forth. There's a great line from Charles Dickens where one of the characters says, the past is a different country. They do things different there, right? I think Dickens is right that yes, people in the past do things differently than we do. But I also think he may be overstating the case a little bit. I mean, folks in the past, whether it was ancient Rome or ancient India, or even just Campbell, California of 1896, they were just like us too. I mean, the same basic emotions, the same basic impulses, the same hard wiring, I think is present in most folks across history. We can maybe come back to the psychopath discussion later, but the same basic impulses are there, I tend to believe. And so I'm kind of looking for them. Whenever I read about a case, I'm trying to understand what was going through through their mind, through their head, through their heart, whether they're on the side of the angels or they're the one holding the axe. And I thought you're picking up on the questions surrounding James Dunham in this particular case, Dee, as you guys were talking through it, was a very sensitive kind of we don't know everything that was going on with this particular guy. We know some things, but we actually don't know what his internal makeup was. So how can we put ourselves in his shoes in a particular kind of way? Again, not to glorify or empathize or sensationalize, not to glorify or sensationalize, but to empathize and to understand their aspects of the story which we can't fully know. I guess I tend, as I'm reading a case, whether it's contemporary, whether it's Victorian era, wherever it's set, could be pirates, right? We've done a pirate series and that was fun. I guess I'm just trying to understand, what is the impulse behind these particular acts that drive people to such terrible deeds, and really at heart, perhaps a better question is, they did something terrible. In nearly every case we look at, yes, but did they think they had any choice? And I think that's a question that can be asked, so often and fruitfully, without necessarily gauging in undue speculation. And, the more you learn about an individual, the more you learn about their context, their environment, what are the material circumstances they're dealing with, on to Tobin's book, one of the things that we had to grapple with, and maybe we should have done more so in our interview with Tobin, was, the killer marries into this family, marries Hattie Wells, right? Well, what were the options for a young woman in the 1890s? Right? I mean, like, we need to think about, like, well, what kind of social mobility did she have without a husband in that era? Less than we would probably like to admit, So maybe, like, she doesn't exactly think this is the best partnership, but she needs a partnership in order to be able to survive. And so she's compromising in some way.
That's a really good point, Ben. And it's not something I had considered, because I think it was me who brought up the question of...
It was.
Why go with the brother? Like, jeepers.
Yeah.
But like,
Right.
I'm coming at it from a very different point of view, with the makeup of today. So yeah, that's a really good point to bring up.
Context. It's about context.
Yeah.
And I think that, that's something that I'm always searching for in terms of similarity and difference. In what ways is the context of the past that we are looking at in any given book similar to ours? And in what ways does that difference need to be bridged, as you say? I think, as a host, that's something that I try to draw out with our guests, with our authors. But I always, as I said earlier, they're the ones who have the answer. You know what I mean?
And I don't want to jump around too much. I want to talk a little bit about the McGlinchey murders, but we did also listen to some of the most recent episodes. So there was the interview with Richard Selden about Richmond, Virginia, and the one with Kim Kenny from Ohio. And I think in the Richard Selden interview, it was interesting to me on this point, similar to like what were the options in 1890s in Campbell, California, but for Elsie Snipes in Richmond, Virginia in the mid 1920s. And I think you tried to tackle that of like she maybe was portrayed as like a fast woman or whatever, but like
floozy, a flapper, all that,
yeah, but from her perspective, like she was, I think she had children maybe. And so there's her story and trying to understand like why would she be with this man, but then also the wife of the murderer, and why would she perjure herself to defend him? Like, why would she stay with him? Like, how does her faith play a role? How does her, was it 5 children factor into this? How does her lack of independent opportunities as a woman in that time period in this place factor into that? And I feel like you surface those issues in a way. Don't pass judgment on these people. Like, I feel like I really appreciate that in that particular interview of how it could have been easy to pass judgment on some of these people and some of the choices they made. But I thought it was a very fair and balanced portrayal. I don't really have a question there. I just more of an observation.
I appreciate that. That's kind of you to say so, and it's something that we do try for. I try to humanize wherever possible. Now, I think that is really important to me because these folks are not necessarily here to speak for themselves in this day and age, and so I try to offer the benefit of the doubt, and to try to really just see them in the complexity, I think, which we all deserve, the sort of fullness of a person's makeup, which sometimes gets flattened even in good historical writing. It's like we just know there's more to the story, so how can we draw that out? Now, I want to say, by contrast to that, though, some of the more interesting cases that we have to deal with are the ones in which you come up against a hard, and I mean a hard, wall of impregnability. And what I mean by that is when you have somebody who is legitimately psychopathic, who is ice cold, blood in their veins, whose intent is to ruin and to kill, and is the closest thing to a manifestation of evil in this world. Because I read a lot of books for this show, and I run into a lot of individuals who seem to be just like cut from a different cloth. And I'll give you one example of a recent interview that we did. It was a little while back, about 6 months ago. Clay Bryant's book on murder in Georgia. You know, he was an investigator. He's law enforcement, and he wrote the book about the case that he worked on. And there's a woman who killed a man that she had seduced, and buried him in a well in her backyard, and the whole thing was just meticulously plotted out, from the seduction to the stealing him away from his wife and family, to him moving in with her, to taking everything that he owned, making it hers, killing him, disposing of the body, lying about it through her teeth, and it's just like every single aspect of this woman who ended up dying in jail, or will die in jail if she's still alive. Everything about her, you just like, it's revulsion and horror at somebody who could do this. It is manipulative, it is controlling, and it is ultimately just deadly in every aspect, not just in terms of the homicide, but relationally deadly. I mean, she killed everything that she touched of this individual. And we run up against those walls sometimes in the work that we do for this show. And the authors, of course, are right up against it, in their research and in their investigation. And so they really give me a lot of pause for thought, Jeff. I mean, like, they give me a lot of pause for thought about how can I humanize or empathize with this person. I don't always have an answer for that. I mean, when I run up against someone like her, this is Clay Bryant's book, it leaves me with a big fat question mark as to how I can understand it, and sometimes I fail.
Yeah, I mean, we've run into a similar problem with some of the podcasts that we've listened to, where we're really trying to understand, how does someone become this person who does these things? And I think, like we said, we liked how, I think you try to investigate that, but there's other times where we've listened to a show and those questions are unanswered, and it can be frustrating, I think, as a consumer of that story. I think sometimes we're drawn to those stories. I feel like sometimes those stories are the most interesting because they are the darkest, but they are unsettling in a way.
They are. Yeah, you want to touch them, as we here in the South, we say, wouldn't touch that with a barge pole. Yeah. I would say a barge pole is about the shortest implement with which I would touch a story like that. I'm gonna keep my 10 feet between me and it.
I'm laughing because I love finding out phrases that come from Ireland, but we use that phrase in Ireland as well. Jeff, is that a phrase that you use?
Nice.
Ever?
I've never heard that phrase.
Stop, really? We say that in Ireland
on.
as well. That is so funny.
Well, we also say premise here in the South, which I understand was a source of some controversy last time.
Oh gosh, we're going to go into pronunciations now.
I love it. It's just I find it so fascinating how, we speak the same language, but we pronounce things very differently. I think it's hilarious. Yeah. Just on the note, before we move on, we really need to jump into the McGlinchey murders, but I would like to ask, as we were talking about Richard Selden there, he mentioned how he preferred when people were dead for kind of a long time before he writes about them, which I found an interesting comment. But I was wondering, from you, do you feel like focusing on like historical murders gives you more of a license for candor? And I do appreciate that you do speak about these stories in a very respectful way, but I feel like maybe you get more of a license for candor, or allows you to be a little bit more lighthearted than maybe if you were discussing a more recent crime.
Oh, that's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. What a fun thing to think about. I mean, does the distance give us a little bit of does the slack in the line give us a little bit of room to play there? Maybe sometimes are we more free to speak without fear of retribution? I mean, it depends on whether I'm willing to stay up at night, retributing my soul for making fun of someone who can't fight back. No, I don't like to do that. I will say that we do love kind of the opportunity to tell some of the more absurd stories, or the ones which kind of like have some levity built into them, regardless of their epoch. So we've done a Christmas story about like a modern day Santa Claus, who flew around on his sleigh in the Northeast. There's a Massachusetts book. It'll come to me in a second. Which is sort of like some guy basically styled himself as like an airplane Santa dropping off, presents on a Massachusetts beach, which was quite fun. There wasn't a lot of crime in that particular episode. We wanted to kind of lighten it up a little bit, but it was a fun story alongside some other crime stories. One of my absolute favorites, and were my producer Bill Huffman, who is the show host of Who Killed, which is a great show. You guys should definitely reach out to Bill and chat with him. Were he here, he would be shaking his head in absolute dismay at what I'm about to say, because he would he would know I'm about to mention to you one of my absolute favorite cases of all time, which we did I think in the spring of our first year, which is a book by Laurie Burbridge, and it is a book about when a dog was put on trial for murder. Yes, see, exactly. I saw your face there, Dee. Yes, I had the exact same reaction when I first heard about the book. I said, what? So, I mean, we have the interview. It's on file, and there was a little boy, young boy, who was... what was he doing? He was swimming in a canal in upstate New York, and was swimming with his friends, and his dog came through and wanted to play with him in the water while swimming, and let's just say only one of them made it back out, right? It's a very sad story. Like, this young boy was drowned, but it became, as you can imagine, the town tried to put the dog on trial for the murder of the child, and what happens is, Laurie writes about this in her book really well. What happens is you end up in a situation like this, deep in the weeds of medieval, like arcane medieval criminal law, right, dating back to France in the sort of 1400s, when they're trying to figure out whether they can try a pig for being a witch and things like that, right? But there's precedent for how you hold non-human actors responsible for events that contribute to, human loss and so forth. It's in the court systems. So, like, we love a good rabbit hole. We will happily make ourselves a little home in a rabbit hole when need be. But a book like that, even though it is about a sad story, there are these kinds of absurd and surreal moments which we can't resist drawing out. Yeah, let's talk about, like 14th century French legal theory regarding, like pigs for a minute. Like, let's go there. So, does that answer your question? I don't know.
Well, I was going to say, I think that gets at something that we often talk about with our show, sometimes on the show, but often behind the scenes of our show, of what's the right tone to strike with some of these things, right? Like, sometimes we want to talk about, like, we want to give the proper respect to the people involved, particularly when there are families and close ones still alive. But there are also these crazy things that happen that deserve to be called out as just bizarre or funny or whatever. Well, let's actually we should ask a couple things specifically about the McGlinchey murders.
Yeah, sure.
Before we run out of time, Dee, did you want to go first?
I'll go first. Mine is a nice light question to start us off. And one thing Jeff and I debated is whether James Dunham, the criminal in this case, if he actually fled the Bay Area to Mexico or somewhere else, or if he stayed nearby watching over his son and admiring the attention his case got. Do you have any feelings on that? I want someone else to weigh in on this. You do?
I do.
Fantastic.
I do have feelings. Thoughts. No, I don't have facts, but I do have a feeling or two about
feelings.
it. Yes,
we're good with feelings on this podcast. Okay, feelings and vibes.
The stray intuition that comes our way, we're good with that. Yeah, I think because, and Tobin talked about this a little bit in our interview with him. It also pertains to the horse fact, right? Like, we know each other by our horses in that era. I think that too many people would have recognized him. I think he was too well known in the community, through his history, through bouncing around, through being a drifter, and regardless of the fact that, most of those late 1890s farmhand style guys looked, more or less wore the same clothes and had the same mustache and, that sort of thing. I think it is really interesting that every single case of mistaken identity that followed him throughout proved to be mistaken. And I think that, had he remained in the area, specifically the area, in the Santa Clara Valley, I just think he would have been recognized too soon. I just think it's too small a community in that particular day and age. It's not now, but it would have been then.
Do you think, so one thing we talked about was, so there were a couple of these other men who got arrested and brought to the area. Do you give any credence to the idea that one of those may have actually been him with a colluder?
I don't know. So I went back to Tobin's book before we sat down today, because you guys raised the interesting question about what's the difference between Hatfield and Krill, right? There was a little kind of question about that. And for our listeners who are not familiar with the case, after James Dunham escapes the murder scene and gets he ends up in the wind, right? But these alleged sightings of him start to come in from all over the country. They sort of radiate outwards, right, from California down through Texas and Iowa and Mexico and all these different places. The more time passes, the sort of the ripples on the lake surface get further and further out. Anyway. The investigating sheriff, Langford, went to go find these particular people, to meet them, to speak to them. And I'm thinking particularly of Krill and Hatfield in Texas and Krill in Iowa. And, they were able to determine, based on identifying features, that, it's just that there are some hard facts here. In fact, Tobin has a table. I can quote a couple things from it for you. Tobin has a table for Charles Krill of about 15 what he calls points of similarity in Krill's appearance and Dunham's, but they're not all similarities. So, for instance, teeth. James Dunham in 1896, teeth, one front, one filled. Charles Krill in 1901, teeth, corresponding tooth and another front one gone, okay? Sure, could a tooth have disappeared in 5 years? Yeah, probably. But, complexion, clear for James Dunham. Krill, tanned. I'm just quoting directly from his book right now. Are there some eerie overlaps? Yeah, sure, absolutely. But, look, the original investigators, they went and they interviewed these particular folks because they were being held, on suspicion. And I don't know, I think one of the reasons that we wanted to feature this book is because all the evidence suggests he got away from the crime, but I'm with Tobin. I just don't think he made it that far. I just don't see how you make an unplanned escape in very rough territory in Central California mountains, without having time to prepare. It didn't go the way he thought it was going to go. He didn't have the opportunity to, to assemble his kind of bug out bag or, whatever you would have called it in those days. And he had to flee. He withdrew all of his money. I'm sure he was spending it like crazy, just trying to stay alive. The further out you get, you get fewer and fewer places you can resupply in those mountains in that age. I put his chances at kind of like, it's hard for me to imagine him, really making it all that far before he gets into a very deadly situation.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about that. We talked about how far it is from here in the Bay Area to Mexico, and just how hard it would have been to do that at that time on horseback, presuming he didn't ride a bike. But I was driving back and forth to LA actually recently, which is not the whole way, but it's a good chunk of the way. And even today, like, there's a whole lot of nothing between here and LA. And then once you get to LA, there's bigger mountains. There's harder mountains to get through. And it's rougher terrain, right? Like, those are significant landscapes to cross. especially, like you said, without being prepared for that, without having planned for it. I don't know. I'm skeptical, I guess, the more I kind of mull this over.
Yeah, I mean, that's what makes the case so enigmatic, is that we'll never actually know, and that's rare. I think so often you kind of get something which kind of points you in a direction, and that's kind of what prompts even the ability to write the book in the first place. So this is one of those rare ones where it's like, who can say, who can say?
On the McGlinchey case, on Dunham and what he did that night of the murders, the act of going around trying to find every photograph of himself, I feel like stands out as the most savvy, clever thing that he did. But are you aware of any like precedent? Like, was that a common practice at the time of murderers or like criminals to like be thinking about like, this is the best way to identify me, let me destroy all that evidence? I'm just wondering if that's one of those things that over the last 130 or so years, like people today commit these crimes, they don't think that all of their data is on the cloud.
Yeah.
Right?
That's right. Yeah, good question. I think that is the difference between premeditated and spur of the moment kinds of murders. You know what I mean? And first of all, I mean, reproduction technology in those years was still very nascent, and the particular type you were thinking was a tintype photograph was what was the successor to the daguerreotype. But I think that shows the level of calculatedness, that he did have an agenda and a plan, and that he had thought out. We know that he had thought it out ahead of time, and I think one of Tobin's points, which was really interesting, was that remember, he had studied at a college of law. I mean, and his professor said he was extremely intelligent and bright. Yeah. They never disputed his acumen in that respect. So, I mean, yes, I think he did have an agenda, a plan, and that was part of it. I think so often in the heat of the moment, when you get into an argument and the gun goes off, or, somebody hits somebody else too hard and it turns into a worse situation, or we just did a whole series on crimes of passion, where things go wrong. Yep. And, I think that's where people make the most mistakes. But in this particular case, I can say, Jeff, I was fascinated by that detail as well. I agree with you. I think that was one of the single most sort of, what is the best word to use here, perspicacious things that he did. I don't approve of it, obviously, but like, man, that was smart. And it tells me that there really was a kind of forethought, to the whole thing. Yeah. Crazy, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
Given that he did that, though, is there no room for the fact that he may have planned an escape better? Like, well, I know he went on the horse and he had the bike, but like, if he's planning to take the photos, why isn't he planning for what he's going to do after?
Because no plan survives contact with the enemy, as my father used to say. He was a Vietnam vet and a surgeon, I'd like to point out, not a combatant, but a surgeon. But, the first casualty of war, as they say, is always the plan. And two things there that speak directly to that principle for you, Dee. Number one, remember, George Shavers survived the assault. Yeah. He was in the barn, right? He heard the killing. He knew what was happening. He hid. Remember, James Dunham goes up there looking for him, doesn't find him. I mean, in arguably one of the scariest scenes of the entire book. He's like up in the barn loft with a torch looking for the next guy that he has to kill in order to get away clean. And this guy's hiding in what is, I think, a haystack, right? Or something like that. So George Shavers survives, so he knows what has happened and is able to, summon the authorities. And then remember, chance always plays a role in these encounters as well. And so I don't think that was his trying to do something that it didn't work out that way. So that's one complicating factor. Other complicating factor is the element of randomness or chance, in that you remember when he was fleeing the scene, he stopped, and there was another farmhand that he stopped and had a conversation with, who recognized him as Dunham, who knew him, right? And think about, like, if he's trying to get away in the middle of the night, because this happened in the early hours of the morning, he would have hoped that he would not run into anybody on the road, much less anyone who would recognize him. Right. Yeah. So he would have been hours and hours in the clear, from that point. And that way his alibi of, oh, I came back and found them like this, would have held a lot more water. But if he is seen by an acquaintance leaving the property, shortly after the murders took place, I mean, what is a sheriff gonna say to that? I mean, like, anything Dunham tries to say after that is just moot.
I suppose from my mind, though, if he removes the photos, is he planning to come back? Like, I got it from, like, he's trying to get the money. Basically, it's
sure.
Money is often one of the biggest factors, but like, he's removed the photos, so. Is he going to plan to come back? Like, why remove the photos if you're come back? Because that makes you look weird.
Unless nobody ever knew that the photos existed. Unless people didn't know the farmstead and the homestead well enough to have expected to find them there, right? So, maybe it was sort of just like a little insurance policy for him in case anyone thought. I think he got unlucky on those two counts. With George and with this, acquaintance on the road. And I think that batch of luck, bad luck, completely confounded whatever plans he had to potentially return to the property, because, the law enforcement was mobilized, the crime scene was activated, so to speak. The search party was formed, the amazing bloodhounds, got together and started doing their thing. And it was sort of like any buffer that he would have had, any plausible window of deniability, just evaporated, and he suddenly had to go to not even plan B or D, but plan P or Q, and just hightail it. So yeah, it's a great question. It's a great question.
I want to know, Ben. So we've talked a lot about crime. We've talked about some pretty gruesome crimes. When you're not listening or reading these stories, talking to these authors, what's the other end of the spectrum for you to kind of take the edge off of this kind of content?
I'm going to guess it's reality TV, Ben. That's what I'm going to go with.
Bourbon? Wait, is that the bourbon question?
I mean, we mix those on our show.
I love it. I love it.
Yeah. No, I think it's a couple things. That's a lovely question too, and I think when you spend time in the deep end of the pool, how do you kind of wade back to the shallow end so you can get out again? You know what does it a lot for me, actually. I could make all sorts of like snide bourbon jokes, but I won't. Actually, I'm going to tell you what I really think. What so often does it for me is when I think about how I have come to hold a book like the one that I'm reading in my hands. I think about all of the people in law enforcement, the investigators, the sheriffs, the lieutenants, the detectives, who immediately swing into action to try to find who did this terrible thing, and how can we prevent it from happening again? How can we, find them? Their selflessness, and we speak to a lot of them on the show, and that includes judges as well, folks directly in the justice system, who've written books. I think about all the folks on the side of the angels who are out there trying to actually bring killers to justice. It's like there are more of them than there are the killers. You know what I mean? And I think about like their contributions towards telling these stories, towards bringing injustices to light, towards delivering the person into the hands of our due process system. I think about the fearlessness of the journalists involved who have to go and really dig deep into these particular cases, and in some cases I think again of Jesse Pollock, stand up against law enforcement who's not giving them the full story. And actually law enforcement is not perfect, we know that, and we have many instances in which the journalist is the one who actually is the truth seeker in this particular case, and they find it, right? I mean, they get enough freedom of information requests, or they, kind of get the right person on the case who actually moves it forward finally, through persistence and questioning. I think about all the thing that takes me out of the darkness of the true crime, kind of reality, is all the folks on the side of the light, who are out there trying to ensure that that victims have their stories told properly, that, in the case of Rita Schuler, who don't rest for 40 years when a young woman is killed, and who, on the strength of a single partial palm print that's left behind at the scene, decide to go back and reevaluate every single piece of evidence that was associated with that case and find the guy who killed her, right? Like, I think about that, and it's like those folks who are out there tirelessly just, seeking the truth and doing everything they can, for the sake of the families, for the sake of those who are left behind. That does a lot for me, it just, because they're working right now, even as you and I speak, right? We just don't know it because we're not, right alongside them, and we won't read about their efforts that come to fruition for some time, until they do. But in so many cases, they do come to fruition, right? And it's like, I'm so grateful for that. So there's a whole other spectrum of people on the side of the angels, whether it's book editors, booksellers. I say that with my author hat on. Bless them and bless them twice, who are part of that particular ecosystem. But, when I read, these cases, and I think about somebody like Clay Bryant, who is now on his 3rd or 4th book, but he's also on his probably 300th or 400th homicide case, right, as an active investigator with state of Georgia. I just think, like, man, this is immensely reassuring. Like, I know guys like Clay are out there, and they're actually doing the real work here. We're downstream of that, and I try to remember that. So that's kind of what brings me out.
I think that's a great perspective. That
and the bourbon. That and the bourbon, or good scotch. I lived in Scotland for several years, so I will take a single malt any day of the week.
Well, Ben, thank you so much for taking this time to speak with us. This was really wonderful. It was great to hear just more behind the scenes of Crime Capsule, more about your process, and also just to chat more about this particular case with the McGlinchey murders. I think we could have gone on all day about that one.
I know.
We didn't even get to touch on the Stark County, Ohio one.
Which I loved. I loved that one. But anyway.
Oh, wasn't it fun? Wasn't it fun?
Yeah.
Let's do it.
So
Anytime. I'd love to come back and hang out with you guys. This has been a real pleasure.
Yeah, that sounds like a good plan. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. We really appreciate it.
Anytime at all. It's a joy.
Next time, we're going to marry my two loves together. True crime and reality TV.
I'm sorry, Dee, what? You have found a true crime podcast that involves reality TV?
Indeed, I have. We're going to dive into the podcast Price of Paradise, where we hear what happens when someone buys an island and moves their whole family over, only to find the island was not up for sale in the first place.
That's on the next So Much Crime.
So little time.
So Much Crime, So Little Time is a production of Mind Glove Media. The executive producer is Paxton Caloriso. Our associate producer is Blythe Ty. Our theme music was composed by Vyacheslav Starostin. If you haven't done it yet, please subscribe to this show on your podcast app. And don't forget to give us a 5-star rating and a review. Even better, tell your friends. To join the discussion, look for us on social media. Check out the show notes for all the links. Thanks for listening.